Thanks very much, Judith. I should probably start by apologising. I'm afraid I took my lead from the House of Commons, and I think I'm the first man not to be wearing a tie today. But perhaps Oxford is even behind the House of Commons. So Bob started his talk by saying, sometimes good Bob turns up and sometimes bad Bob turns up. I'm afraid it is only bad Paul when it comes to me talking about the public finances, because I only see bad things ahead on the whole. I've been asked to talk about Brexit and the public finances, so I'm actually not going to say, although I could, I'm not going to say terribly much about tax. Of course, we know what Brexit means for the public finances. We'll be 350 million quid a week better off. I won't labour the point that is a silly number. The actual gross number is 250 million quid a week, and the net number is 150 million quid a week. And that's before any second round effects. It's a bit odd, isn't it? I think we kind of quote footballers' salaries in pounds per week because 200 grand a week sounds less than 10 million a year, but we seem to quote this in pounds a week because that sounds more than 10 billion a year if you've got hundreds of millions a week. But so that's the first round is that we will be giving back less to the EU, but obviously it's not quite that. It's obviously not quite that simple. And I'm not going to talk very much more about that, and I'm certainly not going to say much more about the exit charge, which it looks like we're going to be negotiating. People are talking anything between 60 and 100 billion euros, which, as I understand it, is a number we're going to have to agree before we're allowed to negotiate anything else. Now, that, apart from anything else, is going to cause some problems, I think, in Parliament when that bill is agreed. Now, I'm no expert on that, but I think the two things are worth saying. First, 60 billion euros might actually be quite a small amount to pay for some of the trade deals and so on that might come on the other end of it. Secondly, it is a strange way, actually, of that they have of the rules here. I mean, it'd be rather like Scotland declaring independence and us charging them for everything that Parliament agreed to in terms of building aircraft carriers and Trident and so on into the next several years. But let's not go into that. So that's the kind of the arithmetic. But the stuff that really matters, of course, is the impact of where we're going to go on growth and then the knock-on effects on the public finances. It's worth just remembering where we are with the public finances at the moment. We have a deficit which is still knocking on for 3% of national income. That's an awful lot less than it was back in 2010 when it was 10% of national income. So we have brought that down a lot. We've been through 7 years of austerity, and all of that work has got us to a state which is exactly the same size as it was in 2008 after 10 years of Labour government. So all of that pain has just got us back to spending as a fraction of national income where it was in 2008. Why has we had all that pain? Well, it's because we've had no economic growth to speak of over that period, which is just a very good example of why the only thing in the end actually that matters for the public finances is economic growth. And that's why, of course, Brexit is going to make the public finances worse, because if you make trade with your nearest and biggest trading partner more expensive, you'll get worse off. And that is basically all the economics you need to know to understand at least the direction of travel in terms of where we're going to end up as a result of coming out of the single market, if that is what we do. So the Office of Budget Responsibility's initial estimate was that Brexit, as a result of the Brexit vote, we'd be borrowing 15 billion or more pounds a year more in 2020 than we otherwise would have been. Where that, in my view, is likely to grow over time because the impact of lower investment and less trade will accumulate. The OBR actually takes a somewhat more sanguine view of that, but there is clearly a cost to the public finances there. Where are we in terms of the government's targets? Government has said it wants to get to a 2% of national income deficit by 2020. and to get to budget balance in the mid-2020s. I reckon the mid-2020s stretches at least to 2028. It could even reach to 2029. So we've got quite a lot of time, actually, to get to, if you take these long-term targets at all seriously, we've actually got quite a lot of time, according to the government's fiscal rules, to make what is a relatively small adjustment now to get from about 2.5% of national income down to 2 and then to 0, when we've already got from 10 down to about 2.5 over the last 6 or 7 years. But we've got a period clearly of significant economic uncertainty over the next few years, and it wouldn't take an enormous hit from Brexit or anything else to put even that 2% target in jeopardy. And the other thing that's worth saying is that even though that extra bit of fiscal deficit reduction that's promised over the 2020s doesn't look enormous, we are going through a period in which the demands on public spending are growing. The number of pensioners has actually risen by 2 million over this decade, and the numbers will grow even faster over the next decade. So the pressures on health and the pressures on pension spending are increasing, which is actually one of the other reasons why the apparent austerity, or the actual austerity over this period, has felt so difficult, because the amount we're spending on pensions in particular has risen quite fast, which has had to push everything else down. So that's the rather gloomy outlook, I'm afraid, for the public finances. Now, there is room for manoeuvre there, I think it's fair to say. I don't think the world is going to fall over if the government does decide to borrow a few billion or even a couple of tens of billion more over the next few years. And indeed, if the economy starts to go badly, almost certainly additional borrowing would be the appropriate response, up to a point. And what that point is, I'm not sure. The big constraint here is that debt as a fraction of national income is approaching 90%. And if we do have a big downturn at any point, that could rise above 100% pretty quickly. And then some of the risks may begin to crystallize. Of course, we've already had a fiscal loosening in response to the deficit, to Brexit. First thing that George Osborne did, and then Philip Hammond continued with, was to say, no longer aiming for budget balance in 2020, we're going to push that way back. So there's been some loosening just because the economy is already predicted to do less well, but also Philip Hammond did spend more. He particularly put forward considerably more on capital spending going forward, and a few other bits as well. So we have had some fiscal loosening already in response to this uncertainty and threat that Brexit poses. So let me end up just by saying a little bit about where the policy response at a kind of macro level might be on tax. Well, I think overall, I think the political situation is such that tax is it's extremely hard to see how taxes are going to rise over the next few years beyond anything that's already on the books. You couldn't even get the small and the much needed increase in self-employment national insurance contributions through the Parliament before the election was called, and now now the Conservatives have decided to have a smaller majority, or indeed no majority at all. The chances of getting any tax increase through seem to me to be very small. So I think the chances of tax increases are just, for entirely political reasons, let alone economic ones, are pretty small. What about tax cuts? So you've heard Judith say that others are slightly worried that we might become the Hong Kong of Europe. I mean, I hope she means in terms of tax rather than democracy, but I have worries on both counts. But if we are to have tax cuts, where might they come? Well, obviously you get more political bang for your buck by cutting taxes on income. The personal allowance continues to rise. It was in the Conservative manifesto to raise it a little further. We've already spent $10 billion, spending $10 billion a year on a higher personal allowance than we had back in 2010. That does support people's incomes, and given how badly people's incomes are doing for other reasons, we may see we may see more of that. So supporting household incomes may well be a priority, all against the backdrop of the deficit, don't forget. But what about corporation tax? Well, we are, as you know, due to see the rate come down to 17%. The politics, the economics, I mean, is that in danger? I don't know. I mean, if I were the Chancellor looking for a bit more money at relatively low political cost, I might be thinking about not raising corporation tax, but I might be thinking about undoing that cut. I don't know. But let me finish on the sort of politics of the differences. As Judith said, the idea that we now have a stable and certain anything in the UK seems to be somewhat out of the window. And just reflect on where the two main parties are on corporation tax. You had the Conservatives going into the election saying they're going to cut the headline rate further to 17%. So a cut from a huge cut over the period since 2020, into which they have invested a huge amount of money in the context of austerity. I mean, quite remarkable sort of political and economic statement about the importance of low corporation tax, with the intention of going further. The Labour Party, on the other hand, had some pretty hefty corporation tax increases in its manifesto, and given the political balance, I think one needs to take this as a serious possibility going forward. They wanted to take the main rate of corporation tax up to 26%, raising, according to the Ready Reckoner, around £20 billion a year. Whether you would get that in the long run, I'm sceptical about. But not only that, there was £9 billion of anti-avoidance measures in there, and another £4 billion of unspecified reductions in corporate tax allowances. I reckon that makes over £30 billion increase in corporation tax on a £50 billion base, which is what we get at the moment. That is an enormous and extraordinary change to the way in which we tax corporates that was proposed by the opposition. So I don't think we've ever seen, certainly not in the last 30 years, such a big gap between the main parties. Clearly a political situation in which we don't know what the next government will be, and therefore it seems to be more uncertainty about what the corporate tax system will look like in 5 years' time than at any point that I can remember. I will stop there, give others plenty of time to talk about the interesting bits of tax, and hopefully be a little bit more cheerful. Thank you.